Hello from sizzling London. Welcome to this British Museum event to everyone from across the globe. Please tell us in the chat box where you're listening from. We would love to know. My name is Hilary Williams. I have had the privilege of creating the programme of public events to complement the museum's superb exhibition on Thomas Becket. The world of pilgrimage is articulated very strongly within this exhibition. Much of that awareness of pilgrimage to Canterbury, to the shrine of Thomas Becket, has been perpetuated by Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. That poetic work is often described as the most influential poem of the medieval period. Read for its use of English, it has kept alive the knowledge of Becket and his status, amongst many other things. To discuss Chaucer and his influence, it's such a delight to welcome our two speakers, Professor Marion Turner and Patience Agbarby. They will answer some of your questions at the end if you would like to write them in the Q&A box rather than in the chat. First of all, Marion Turner is Professor of English Literature at Jesus College, University of Oxford. She's the author of the much acclaimed biography, Chaucer, A European Life, published by Princeton in 2019, which was chosen as Book of the Year in 2019 by The Times, The Sunday Times, and The Times Literary Supplement, and was a New Statesman Book of the Year in 2020. Chaucer, A European Life was also shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize in 2020, and it has won 3 other prizes. Patience Agbarby, who is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, is a poet and performer whose work has been inspired by Chaucer, among many others. Her volume, Telling Tales, published in 2014, offers a 21st century take on the characters, poetry and performance elements of Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Patience often tours her performances of Telling Tales across the UK and is also a contributor to and supporter of the Refugee Tales project. Poet Laureate Simon Armitage described Telling Tales as, and I quote, "the liveliest versions of Chaucer you're likely to read," end of quote. Patience is also an honorary associate member of the English faculty at Oxford University. So we're in really good hands today. So may I start by asking Marion to take it from here. Marion.
Thank you, Hilary, and huge thanks to the British Museum for inviting me to talk at this event. And even bigger thanks to everyone who's signed up and is listening to us from all around the world. It really is a pleasure to be talking to such a global audience tonight. So I'm going to be talking a bit about Chaucer and his European context. So I'm going to begin by talking about how Becket connects to the Canterbury Tales. And then I'll move on to talk a bit about the European context of Chaucer's world and his writings before we move on to modern adaptations and then Patience's own poetry. So if the audiovisual people can put up my PowerPoint, I will be able to get going. Great. Okay, so I thought we would begin at the beginning. The opening lines of the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales, which are Chaucer's most famous lines and some of the most famous lines in English poetry. So this is the only time I'm going to ask you to indulge me with some Middle English. And I'm just going to read out this opening, the first sentence of the Canterbury Tales, but it is a long sentence. One that Aprila, with his sure suitor, the droct of March, had pierced to the rooter, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the fleur. One Zephyrus eke with his sweeter breath inspired hath in every haltant heap the tender crops, and the young sun hath in the ram his half course Iran, and smaller fowls mark and melody that slape an alvenict with open yea, so pricketh nature in her courages, than Longenfook to Goon, on pilgrimages, and palmers for to sake and strange strands, to furna halwers, couth, in sundry lands. And specially from every shire's end of England to Canterbury they wend, the holy blissful martyr for to sake her, that hem hath holpen, wan that they were sicker. So at the end of that extraordinary 18-line sentence, you can hear the reason why people are going to Canterbury. The holy blissful martyr, Thomas Becket, the holy blissful martyr for to seeker, that hem hath holpen, that has helped them when that they were sick, has helped them when they were sick. Because this is a text that opens with this message of healing and regeneration. The idea that people are traveling to Canterbury in order to be healed either of physical or of moral illness, of personal problems, that this trip to Canterbury, this pilgrimage, is going to make things better. And in the very opening of these lines, of the Canterbury Tales, you can hear that message of regeneration. But at the beginning, it doesn't seem to be about necessarily religious regeneration. It's a more universal message, not only a Christian message at the start. So we begin with the idea of a cycle of fertility. So that opening line talks about the sweet showers of April piercing the drought of March and the flower being born from that. When that, and then so when April does this, then this happens. So we have this idea of the penetration of the earth, the birth of the flower. Then we move into a parallel image, another when Zephyrus, when the wind breathes into the fields, the crops are born from that. So we have these two repeated clauses which give us this wonderful sense of regeneration. And the fact that in the poetry, Chaucer himself even mimics the idea of the cycle by saying when. He repeats that, taking us round in a circle. So we get this idea that this keeps happening. It happens every year, in every culture. The seasons go round, things are planted, things are born again. And so one of the wonderful things about these opening lines are the way that the sacred and the secular mingle together. So there is this sense that in springtime, new life is born in crops, in animals, but also springtime matters to the Christian audience of Chaucer's time, because this is the season of Lent and then Easter. So the idea of Christian rebirth and regeneration through Christ's death. And those two things are really going hand in hand at this point. Now, I'm just going to move on to show you how these lines would have appeared to a medieval audience. So I know this is probably hard to make out on the screen, but you get the general sense. So these are those lines that I just showed you in a kind of boring modern font. This is how some medieval readers saw it in one of the earliest texts of the Canterbury Tales, beginning that marvelous sentence about what happens when people want to go on pilgrimage. And I think that when we think about these opening lines about the trip to visit Thomas Becket, something really interesting is going on. We start with this idea of when this happens, when it's April time, when everything's coming to life again. And we don't know at first what we're building up to. It doesn't seem to be a religious text, but then we get to this then people want to go on pilgrimage. But why is that? So partly it's this idea that people want to go on pilgrimage because they want the sacred rebirth that I was just talking about. They want to heal themselves spiritually. But that's certainly not the only thing that's going on. And that's certainly not the only thing that Chaucer's pilgrims are interested in, because Chaucer's pilgrims turn out to be a motley crew, many of whom, including the seemingly religious characters, do not seem to be very strictly religious at all. I mean, in Chaucer's time, everyone in Chaucer's society within this country would certainly have thought of themselves as having a baseline of religiosity, but that doesn't mean that they were really thinking about their souls a great deal. And so lots of them, it comes to be springtime and they want to go on holiday. Just like at the moment, a lot of us would like to go on holiday. And of course, it's very hard to travel at the moment. But from springtime, from April, people start thinking about wanting to go on holiday and to enjoy themselves. And they want to tell stories and have fun. Now, this aspect of pilgrimage was heavily criticised in the medieval era. So hopefully you can see here my next slide. Just waiting for it to click on. Here we go. So the medieval critique of pilgrimage. So in Chaucer's era, lots of people criticised pilgrimage because they said that people were going on pilgrimage not for religious reasons. In that first quotation, this is from the early 15th century, so just after Chaucer's death in 1400. And here someone is saying that people go on pilgrimage because they want to sing wanton songs, they play bagpipes, and with the noise of their singing, the sound of their piping, the jangling of their Canterbury bells, the barking of their dogs, they make more noise than if the king was coming into town. And a half year after their pilgrimage, they are great janglers, tale tellers, and liars, just like the Canterbury pilgrims, who themselves, of course, become great tale tellers on the pilgrimage itself. And my second quotation here is about critique of pilgrimage, is a much earlier text back in the 8th century, where someone writes to the Archbishop of Canterbury saying, please stop women going to Rome all the time. They all become courtesans and harlots and stay in Europe. And this kind of anti-feminist critique of pilgrimage is also very common, the idea that people are going on pilgrimage in order to have sex. So there's a great deal of this kind of criticism of pilgrimage, which ties into the idea that a lot of people are doing this because they want to enjoy themselves. They've stayed inside all winter time. Now they want to go out. They want to have fun. So in setting his famous tale collection, his tale-telling contest, on a pilgrimage, Chaucer is gesturing towards lots of different things. While there is this religious context, pilgrimage is also something that was being heavily criticised in his time, and lots of people would have thought of it as something that was a chance for some people, at least, to have fun. You know, both these things are going on. And by setting his text on this particular pilgrimage, he's also making particular points. So this is the pilgrimage to Canterbury, to Becket's shrine. And this is the most famous English pilgrimage. So there were lots of people at this time went on different pilgrimages, local pilgrimages, or to Walsingham, for instance, over in the east of this country. Some people also went to Europe, particularly to Rome or Santiago de Compostela in Spain. A certain number of people even went to the Holy Land on pilgrimage. But within England, Becket's shrine at Canterbury was by far the most famous pilgrimage. So this seems to be setting this up as quite an English text, perhaps. And people across time, since Chaucer's time, have often talked about Chaucer as a very English poet, as a national poet, as the father of English literature. And this might seem to back this up, that he's setting his text on the way to see the English saint. This pilgrimage goes from London to Kent. So it starts in the just south of London, in Southwark, part of London today, but then outside the walls. And he starts in the pub there, and they travel through the Kent countryside till they get to Canterbury. London and Kent were both places that Chaucer lived in, that he knew very well, places that mattered a great deal to him. So when I'm talking about people historically having seen Chaucer as a very English figure, I'm thinking about comments such as William Godwin in the early 19th century, who called Chaucer the father of our language. G.K. Chesterton, who in the 20th century said, really quite absurdly, that he would be writing in French if it weren't for Chaucer, and added that Chaucer was the father of his country, rather in the style of George Washington, and that he made a national language. He came very near to making a nation. In more recent years, I once read an article about the nationalist UK Independence Party that compared members of that party to the Canterbury pilgrimage. Now, I think this is extremely odd. I think it's an odd way of thinking about Chaucer. And I think the extent of the focus on Chaucer's Englishness is historically misleading. It gives a misleading sense about who Chaucer was, where his stories came from, the kind of world that he lived in. So in my biography of Chaucer, the fact that it's called Chaucer, A European Life, obviously might indicate that that sense of Englishness is not my primary interest. One of the things that I'm interested in this biography is Chaucer's Europeanness, his connectedness, the breadth of his sources, his influences, his travels. This was an extremely well-traveled man, multilingual, who drew his stories from many different languages and many different sources. Even those opening lines that I read out at the beginning of this talk today are profoundly European in all kinds of ways. For instance, they draw closely on a Latin text by a Sicilian author, Guido della Colonne's Historia Destructionis Troiae. as a tale collection, the Canterbury Tales draws on many different tale collections, including Boccaccio's Italian Decameron, written in the Tuscan dialect. In those lines that I read, you may have heard the reference to Zephyrus, which is a reference to Greek mythology, to the west wind. In those lines, you may also have heard words such as pilgrimage and courage, which are French-derived words, which are there alongside words such as strond or londa that derive from Old English. Chaucer also not only wrote in, but in fact invented the iambic pentameter. So the iambic pentameter, which is the 10-syllable 5-stress line. It was refined in later centuries in different ways, but Chaucer was the first to write in this line which is based on 10 syllables. He often uses 11 as well, and 5 stresses. Now, while that line was his invention, he derived it from his reading in Italian poets, particularly reading Italian poets' use of a long stressed poetic line, an 11-syllable line. So Chaucer was really able to do a lot of the things that he did in English poetry because of what he found in the poetry of other cultures and other languages. And indeed, when we look at the sources of different individual Canterbury Tales, they are mainly not English sources. He drew his stories mainly from stories in Latin, French, and most importantly, Italian. It was Italian poetry that really changed what Chaucer could do. When we look at Chaucer's reading more generally, he also, for instance, read Arabic texts in Latin translation. So this was a writer who was steeped in writings from outside of England, and also sometimes from writings within England, but written in different languages, because this was very much a multilingual country in the 14th century. Even in choosing to write in English, in some ways, Chaucer was following a European tradition of writing in the vernacular, particularly following Dante's choice to write in his own Tuscan vernacular and to promote the idea of vernacularity rather than Latinate literature. While we don't know if Chaucer went on pilgrimage, we do know that he travelled a great deal. He was an extremely well-travelled man. So sometimes people think that perhaps it wasn't easy to travel in the 14th century. And of course, your average ploughman was not doing the kind of travel that Chaucer was doing. But for educated, well-off people, travel around Europe was fairly normal. For instance, Chaucer went on a trip to Genoa and Florence. This image here is one of Giotto's frescoes from the Bardi Chapel in Santa Croce in Florence. In the early 1370s, Chaucer went on a trip to Genoa and Florence, where he saw this kind of art, early experiments in perspective in the Italian Renaissance. The reason for this trip was, first of all, and primarily, to try to negotiate a treaty relating to the wool trade with Genoan wool traders, and also to negotiate with bankers in Florence. 5 years later, Chaucer went to Lombardy. So this is an image from one of the palaces of the Visconti, the tyrants who ruled Lombardy at this time. Chaucer was in Lombardy in order to negotiate a marriage alliance, which didn't come off in the end, a marriage alliance for the king, and also to talk to mercenary soldiers there at the time. A few years earlier, in 1366, Chaucer had gone to Navarre in Spain. So while today it's in Spain, in Chaucer's time, this was an independent country, Navarre, ruled by a monarch. And it's an interesting example of how much the geography of Europe has changed over time. Our borders have changed, our understanding of the map of Europe has changed a great deal. One of the really interesting things about Chaucer's trip to Navarre was that he there encountered a more multicultural society, we might call it, than he had encountered before. So the picture that I'm showing you here is a picture, I don't know if you can make it out or not, but it's a picture of the Street of the Jews. The Rua della Giudarea is the modern sign there, which leads up to the palace in which Chaucer's safe conduct was issued when he was there in 1366. So the Jewish community was very important. There's in Olite in Navarre, was very important at court at this time. There was also a prominent Muslim community in Navarre. So in his travels, Chaucer did encounter quite different societies and norms to those with which he was familiar in England, given that in his time in England, the Jewish community had been brutally expelled back in the late 13th century. On his trip to Navarre, he also rode over the Pyrenees in February in the snow, encountering almost certainly things like perils such as bears and wolves in the snowy mountains. So it's really interesting to think about what medieval travel was like. You know, we know, for instance, how long it took him to get to Italy and back, because he was paid by the day. So we can see the weeks that it took to get there and to return again. Chaucer traveled abroad for a number of different reasons. So, for example, his first trip abroad, as far as we know, was a trip in 1359 to 1360 when he fought in the 100 Years' War. And we particularly know about that trip because he was, in fact, taken prisoner on that trip. So he was a prisoner of war, and then he was ransomed by the king. He was only a teenager at that time. So again, I find it very interesting to think about his traveling experiences. At that very young age, he experienced what it was like to be imprisoned, to lose his liberty in a foreign country. Well, on that trip then, he travelled in order to fight. That was not usually why Chaucer travelled. He travelled for a number of reasons, but usually it was trade, it was diplomacy. I think he was much better at talking than at fighting. He travelled in order to talk to people, to make connections, to make peace treaties, marriage alliances, those kinds of things. But when he came home as well, he came back to somewhere which was in fact profoundly international. This picture is most obviously of the Tower of London, but it's also of the Thames. The Thames was the artery that connected London and England with the rest of the world. And London was very much connected as a global city, even in the 14th century and indeed much earlier. So in the 14th century, the ships came here bringing spices that had come all the way from Indonesia, for example, that were then sold in the shops and markets of London. Well-off mercantile families such as Chaucer's would access these kinds of products that had come right across the known world at this time by a whole variety of middlemen. And Chaucer himself was brought up in Vintry Ward, so a little bit west of this image. Vintry Ward, the ward where the vintners, the wine merchants, such as his own father, lived. And this was the ward that had more immigrants in it than any other ward of London at this time. It was very much a multilingual place. Living in that ward was probably where he picked up Italian, for instance. It was normal for any educated man at this time to be trilingual in French and Latin as well as English, but Chaucer also had Italian. And then his job for many years of his life was in the Customs House, which was right next door to the Tower of London, shown here. The Customs House. So he worked there in the wool custom. Wool was England's only real export product at this time. It was the foundation of England's wealth, and he was in charge of the taxation on these wool. So he sat there in his office on the river, watching the ships go out laden with English wool, and seeing the ships come in, bringing particularly the fabrics, wood, grain, spices, all kinds of things from all over the world. So Chaucer was a multilingual man who took his stories wherever he could find them, who was really very much aware of England's place in a much bigger world, in webs of connections. Now, across time, since Chaucer's own time, there have been many, many comments on Chaucer's work, which then morphed into adaptations, translations, rewriting. So Chaucer's work has been an inspiration for creativity all over the world. The image that I have here is of some of the different wives of Bath that we have seen in more modern times. So the wife of Bath is perhaps the most famous of the Canterbury pilgrims, and you can see an early image of her here. I'm sure you can spot which one is the medieval image. On the kind of middle left here of the slide. But these other images, I've got Patience Egbarby, from whom we're going to hear in a minute, on the top left. We have Pasolini's Italian wife of Bath in the middle. We have Julie Walters' wife of Bath in the bottom left. On the top right, we have a Brazilian wife of Bath from a few years ago from a play. The bottom middle, we have Jean Vintebreeze, so Caribbean British poet. And on the bottom right, this is a Polish poster of the wife of Bath from the 1970s. And then there's also a poster there advertising Zadie Smith's new play about the wife of Bath, which isn't yet out because the wife of Bath is such a living character. This is going to be out later this year. People are still writing all kinds of new versions of Chaucer's poetry, and they're doing it in lots of different languages. I love lots of these adaptations. some of them, such as Pasolini's, I'm not personally so, but that doesn't matter. There's lots and lots of different ways of writing about Chaucer, of responding to Chaucer's work. So I think it's entirely appropriate and wonderful that Chaucer's texts, rooted in many languages and places themselves, written by a deeply connected poet, have been adapted and translated and reimagined so often. I think that's very true to what he himself was doing. So I think that is probably a good moment for me to end my talk and to bring in Patience Agbargbi, so we can have a little talk about Chaucerian adaptation before we move on to her performance of her work. So I'll just wait for her to come up on screen here. Hi, Patience.
Hi, Marion. Hello.
So I thought that it might be a nice connection between my talk and your performance if we just talked a little bit about adaptation. And I wondered if there were adaptations that you found particularly interesting, apart from your own wonderful telling tales, of course.
Yeah, I mean, there've been several. I think en route to writing my own version, I wanted to see what other people had done. And one of the ones that inspired me was Bubba Brinkman, a Canadian rapper, his Rap Canterbury Tales, which I found really interesting. I think he did 7 of the tales. And another, I'm trying to remember now. One of the things that I found interesting post creating mine has actually been the Refugee Tales, which I sort of really want to say something about, because it's a slightly sort of different project. It's basically it's a walk in solidarity with asylum seekers, refugees, detainees, and people who support them. And it's a walk across the English countryside. It's annual. And the idea is to walk, to use a Chaucerian word, in fellowship, to in a way do the opposite of the hostile environment and actually welcome people and give them a place and safe space to walk and be visible in the English countryside. And also now there is actually a Refugee Tales Cymru in Wales as well. But the idea is also every evening that tales are told. Tales are told as we're walking, naturally people sharing their stories, but every evening there are 2 more formal tales, which are tales that were told to writers. And I was lucky enough was very privileged, I think, to be chosen as one of those writers who would hear somebody's tale. Mine is called The Refugee's Tale, and to then create art from it and to have it published in a book, which is here, The Refugee Tales. This is the first anthology that came out in 2015. So every year there's been a walk, every year there's been an anthology, and very much, yeah, there's been live events, there's been an anthology to try to sort of reach out and to actually, I think, alert people to the disrespect that is put upon asylum seekers, and to try to ask for an end to indefinite detention in the UK. So there's quite a few strands to this amazing project.
I think it's a fantastic project, and it is a text that I've also taught myself here to finalist students, alongside bits of Chaucer, and then within a life writing course, so to help people to think about how experience can be translated into different forms. And I suppose one of the things that I find particularly interesting about the different refugee tales is that mix of forms also that people use, so that each tale really does have its own voice, but also its own poetic form. And I suppose one of the other things that is interesting about that adaptation is, and I think this is true of lots of adaptation of Chaucer and of your own work, is the way that really often very disturbing content is put into poetic form, and sometimes put alongside kind of hopeful messages as well, that those 2 things kind of exist in tension. Because that was also something that I wanted to ask you a bit about, because one of the things that I find really interesting about engaging with the past and teaching the past is the tension between the things that are familiar, look, Chaucer was just like us, there's all these things we can understand, and then the different, which is sometimes just the different, look, they have different understandings of private and public, and sometimes is the extremely difficult, the problematic. And I mean, I know that in your telling tales, you found it very important to do every tale, not to skip the more difficult ones. And could you talk a bit about how you negotiate that tension between the familiar and the unfamiliar when you're engaging with a 14th century text in the 21st century?
Yes, I mean, to use the Prioress's tale as an example, which is quite an anti-Semitic tale. It's about basically Jews killing a young Christian boy. I mean, Hugh of Lincoln is mentioned, but that's what the story's about. And I clearly wasn't going to go down the anti-Semitic route, but I didn't want to sort of hide away from the violence. I mean, there is a lot of violence in Chaucer. I was quite surprised when I revisited Chaucer, having studied him at university, where you often remember the Fabio, the dirty stories, but it's actually, I think, a third of the tales are involve either extreme violence or death. So it's something that I had to kind of grapple with and in a way translate to the 21st century. A particularly disturbing tale is the Physician's Tale, which is about an honour killing, where a man, he kills his 14-year-old daughter to prevent her from, being the mistress of an older man. And it's grueling, terrible problems with that. That was probably the most difficult one. I think it went through about 20 drafts, and in the end I had to create a multivocal piece in order to try to show the different sides, the different viewpoints that you might have in the 21st century, as opposed to the mono viewpoint from the 14th century.
But it's also interesting that you used the phrase there, honour killing, which is a phrase that is still familiar to people today, because a lot of these problems have not gone away. That we do still unfortunately have a lot of the problems that Chaucer saw. We haven't seen a kind of decrease across time. I think when I've looked at, say, adaptations across time, there's often a lot of very misogynistic adaptations in the 20th century. You feel quite surprised sometimes. I've actually found that a lot of the adaptations in the 18th to 20th century were more problematic sometimes than some of the comments, say, from the 15th century. But in the last, particularly in the 21st century, I think there's been quite a new wave actually of adaptations, which have been really exciting. So many of them have been incredible. Obviously, yes, particularly yours.
Yeah, oh, thank you. I'd like to say, I found the BBC did their 6 versions in, I think it was 2002, and I found them particularly helpful. I thought they were very clever, some of them quite dark, and I really liked what they did with them, and of course the presence of women and so on, because that was one of the major things I wanted to redress, in that in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales there are only 2 tales actually told by women, the Wife of Bath and the Prioress. So again, it's very much my intention to try to give much more of a balance and make it much more contemporary in that sense.
Would you have the second nun as well, but she doesn't have a name?
Yes, okay. Yeah.
But yeah, no, absolutely, of course. And I agree, those were good. The Julie Walters image in my final side was from those BBC adaptations. And I think, again, as with the Refugee Tales, they brought in the idea of migrant experience, didn't they? With the way that they adapted the Man of Law's Tale. Yes. And I think that is really interesting, the way that a lot of more recent adaptations have thought about that experience of different kinds of migration. And I'd also recommend people watching to look on YouTube for some of because you can get bits of the Refugee Tales project, can't you? And then you can find Jeremy Irons reading out the opening, which I think is very, very powerful as well.
Yes, I think there was a project called, I think it was 28 Tales for 28 days, because that's what we would wish, that people are not detained for more than 28 days. So a lot of quite famous actors and so on would actually read the tales to just engage with a wider audience. So a lot of people just don't know about some of those issues. And one thing I will also say about the Refugee Tales that's very important is, these are true stories, and the whole purpose behind it was for the voices of the actual asylum seekers to be heard, as opposed to the voices of the press. And that's why the project was begun. Gatwick Detainee Welfare Group were actually asked, look, please, is there a way that our voices can be heard, because they're not being heard?
And I love the fact that whole idea of everyone should have the right to tell their tale is extremely true to the idea of the Canterbury Tales, which moves away from an idea that you only hear from important voices. And the concept of the Canterbury Tales itself is that people interrupt and they assert their right to speak their truth and to be heard telling their own stories. So you have someone low class interrupting and saying, I'm going to speak now. And of course, the Refugee Tales has taken that to a very different level in a different way. But I think that idea of the importance of listening to lots of different voices is really something that comes right across time and has then been reclaimed very powerfully.
Yes, I mean it still stuns me that something written so long ago could have so many different voices, conflicting voices, of a lot of undecidability within the text.
Yes.
I find that very refreshing. I think that's one of the reasons that Chaucer is still enjoyed so much today, that you just get these incredibly this enormous range, you know, which predates most writers by several centuries.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it's very different from other tale collections, you know, having this. So there are other medieval tale collections that don't have this sense of people of all different classes and levels speaking. But we should probably move on and hear your voice, Patience. I think, are you going to kick off with your general prologue?
Yes, I very much am, and I'd also say I haven't really had a chance to say thank you, Marion, thank you, Hilary, and to thank the British Museum, because 10 years ago I did a Chaucer and the Medieval Pilgrimage event, and it's lovely to be back, really, with the book. And so yes, I'm going to begin with my version of the prologue, which is Prologue Grime Mix. When my April showers me with kisses, I could make her my missus or my mistress. But I'm happily hit. Sorry, home girls, said my vows to the sound of the bow bells. Yet her breath is as fresh as the west wind. When I breathe her, I know we're predestined to make music. My muse, she inspires me. Though my mind's overtaxed, April fires me. How she pierces my heart to the fond root, till I bleed sweet cherry blossom en route to our bliss trip. This day she goes off me. April loves me, not April loves me. With the passion, dear doctor, I'm word sick. And I got the itch like I'm allergic. But it could be my shirt's on the cheap side. Serenade overnight with my peeps wide. Nothing like a liqueur, an elixir. Overproof that she serves as my sick cure. She's as strong as a ram, she is Aries. See my jaw-dropping jeans, she could wear these. See my jaw-dropping neat Anglo-Saxon. I got ink in my veins more than Caxton. And it flows hand to mouth is a mouth feast. Verbal freaks from the streets of the southeast. But my April, she blooms every shire's end. Fit or vint, rich or skint, she inspires them. From the grime to the clean-cut iambic. We moyal, rant or rap, get your slam kick. On this route, Master Bus gets cerebral. Tabardin to Canterbury Cathedral. Poet pilgrims competing for free picks. Chaucer Tales track by track, here's the remix. From below the belt base to the top notch. I won't stop all the clocks with a stopwatch. If the rhymes overrun, run offensive, or run clean out of steam, they're authentic. Because we're keeping it real, reminisce this. Chaucer Tales were an unfinished business. May the best poet lose, as the saying goes. May the best poet muse be mainstaying those on the page, on the stage, on the subject. Me and April, we're the rhyming couplet. I'm the host for tonight, Harry Bailey. If I'm tongue-tied, Rachel will bail me. I'm MC, but the M is for mistress. When my April shows me what a kiss is. So that is my version of the general prologue, which is a grime mix. And for those of you who are not familiar with grime, you are now. It's a mixture of rap, punk and grunge, invented in East London. And I very much wanted to begin with something contemporary and London-centric. And that was the closest to Southwark I was going to get. So something else I was really playing with the prologue was I really wanted to honour Chaucer's rhyming couplets. And if you look at it on the page, it looks like iambic pentameter, as Marion was talking about. But if you actually, of course, hear it, it's something totally different. And I like that conflict. And I also like that cheekiness, I think, of trying to insert a female presence by making April, changing April the month to April the muse. So I'd like now to move to my next character, who is the wife of Bath. My version of the wife of Bath is Nigerian. She's larger than life. And what I would do is I will share with you the author biography. Chaucer begins with his amazing general prologue, where you get to hear character descriptions, both of their physical and moral nature. My book ends with fake author biography. So I'd like to just share the one of the wife of Bath, just to give you a little bit of idea about what you're in store for. Mrs. Alice Ebi Buffer. I was born in Nigeria, married at 12, and lived in Ghana until Kwesi died. Then I married a man from Sierra Leone who died on our wedding night. Then I married an Englishman who died. Then a Nigerian who died also. My fifth husband is Toy Boy, live and kicking. So this poem is called What Do Women Like Best? My name is Mrs. Alice Ebi Buffer. I come from Nigeria. I'm very fine, isn't it? My next birthday I'll be 29. I'm a businesswoman. Would you like to buy some cloth? Of all the latest styles from Lagos, Italian shoe and handbag to match, lace, linen and Dutch wax. I only buy the best and I travel first class. Some say I have blood on my hands because I like to paint my nails red, but others call me femme fatale. My father had 4 wives, so I've had 5 husbands. I cast a spell with my gap tooth smile and my bottom power. 3 were good and 2 were bad. The first 2 were old and rich, and I was young and fit. They died of exhaustion. The first from Ghana, second Sierra Leone, the third was white Englishman. Short or tall, black or white, I had race relations with them. They were quiet, simple men, so I told lie to pepper the marriage. Why drink Guinness in my neighbour's household? Is she so fine in her Jimmy shoe? You go vex if I meet Justice Buffer in Lagos Bar and off my phone. Am I Delilah to cut off your head? I accused them of fornication when they could barely stand on their 2 legs. To enter my good book, they go beg. The fourth one was ladies' man. I could not count his women on one hand, but he raged if I look at another man. He puffed his chest like King Solomon, with his wife and concubine. That woman must be faithful and sober. Such talk is not worth 1 copper. I am not a feminax. I do not believe women are equal to men. Women are better. Our chamber of Venus is for both birth and pleasure. I was very wild when I was young. They call me Miss High Life. I was not considered a good wife, but I always respected my husband. He died when I returned from East London. The 5th one I married for love, Chief Justice Aboniki Buffer. He was studying law at University of Ibadan. He was not yet 21, wicked in bed and so handsome, but he liked pornographic magazine. His favourite was Playboy. One day I threw it on fire to teach him a lesson. He turned into a wife batterer. He was to regret his action. I beat him till he begged for his ancestors. Now we get on like house on fire. Some say I'm a witchcraft because I did not bear them children. They do not understand the Western medicine. Since my first husband from Ghana, I had freedom of procreation. He wanted 10 children to pass my hip, but I learned how to wield the whip. Ghana is very advanced. The female owns the children, not the male. This is their folktale I'll tell in my own tongue. What do women most desire? A big man soldier resided in King's household, but outside the compound he saw a small girl 14 years of age and took her by force. He was disgraced and sentenced to death. They must cut off his head. In Ghana, woman was goddess. But the queen pitied his sorrow. She would spare his life if he could answer the question, what thing is it that women most desire in a year and tomorrow? The soldier went on his 2 legs. What do women like best? Some say gold coin, some say fine cloth, some say man be chili pepper hot. Some say freedom, some say marriage, some say women's husband think we can keep secret to chess. None were correct and we failed the means to guess. The year end he must return. Off-road he heard beating of drum and saw plenty women fit and young, dancing in kente cloth, traditional dress of Ghana. They must give him answer, but they disappear into hot air. Only an old madame, suffering from eyes leg rough like yam. Greetings, Nana. I beg your wisdom. What is the greatest desire of women? She smiled. I reveal secret. The soldier boy promised to grant my best wish. He gives her his word and the old madame is elated. Next day, old and young congregated to hear soldier response. Even Mosquito inquired for his reply. Women desire to have sovereignty over their husband or lovers. They want to have mastery over him. If I lie, I forfeit my head for sin. The palace sing jubilation. No woman can contradict him, wife, widow, or virgin. But the old madame with eyes must have her wish, that he must take her hand in marriage. He thinks it worse than death, but soldier must honour his debt. That night, old madame be smiling in bed. It pained him to look his newlywed. Husband, pay your dues to wife. Am I too poor for love? I can redeem myself, sir, but you must redeem yourself also. Your family not give virtue, that from God. You say I old, respect your elder. And if I ugly, I not take lover. Ugliness and age keep me chase. Still he refused to look her face. I can make a man my husband choose. I remain ugly and old and faithful to your body, or young and fine and flirt anybody. What a dilemma. He frowned till he resembled old Papa. My wife, he says, choose for your husband. I place myself in your capable hands. This so pleases the old madame. Kiss me, my husband so handsome. You have given me power you should. I shall be both beautiful and good. Look my face when cock crow, I am very pleasing to you. Her prophecy came to pass, and the marriage consummated in bliss. So, she married a rapist, but he learned his lesson. May God give us young, submissive husbands. You like my head tie? It's the latest fashion. They sell like hotcake on Victoria Island. £50. I give you a discount because I like your smile. The quality is very good. If I take off more, I will not make profit, and I'll travel to Lagos next week. Make it my lucky day. Please, I beg you. Okay, so now you've met my very blunt wife of Buffer, which is very exciting to translate Chaucer's vernacular. And Chaucer's introduction to the Wife of Bath's tale is so full of these amazing asides and exuberance, and I really wanted to sort of bring that across by using the bluntness and directness of Nigerian English, but of course my lines are a whole lot shorter. Okay, so I'm going to we talked earlier a lot about the violence in the Canterbury Tales, so I thought it only right to give you an example of this. I wanted to do my version of the Prioress's Tale, which I decided to, of course, to eschew the anti-Semitism, but set it on an estate in North Peckham in southeast London, the North Peckham estate, and I based it on the actual killing of a black schoolboy called Damilola Taylor, which occurred in 2000 and kind of shocked British people at the time. So so this poem is very much in the voice of the young boy who was actually killed, and it's simply called Sharps and Flats. Dear Mum, it's your son Jay, chatting on a mix made in heaven. Don't hit the fade switch before it's played. Remember, used to have perfect pitch, but my pitch paid a rich trade when I got cut off by a switchblade. No need to pray, you ain't hearing voices. This score is the same voice age 7. Spoke like a thesaurus, wrote long stories. Opened my mouth like the dawn chorus. In God's gang, my chords sang Alma Redemptoris. Mum, I was singing Oh Alma when the blade blast. Tune makes broken windows rainbow like stained glass. Not looking out for the snake in the grass. Gets a boy stained in the vein by the caned class. I took a shortcut, a door shut, was deaf blind to shut the up. Yeah, I mucked up that deadline. I was stuck up and my throat was a red line. At 7, hit heaven before I hit the headline. Martyr, made a martyr for back chatting in Latin sharps and flats. I had no idea what I was chatting. 2 boys from the back that's thought I was back chatting, so they stab with a sharp to cut me off from battling like a rich kid. So the switch did the talk, then the man's lied. Boys in blue twisted your words to you were hands tied in prayer. The nuns held you up like when Dad died. Grief crashing down your face like a landslide. Mum, smile, it's me, Jay, broader and far taller than the boy's voice broke before he could call for help. The star scholar who grew far from squalor. Do re mi fa with my spa Damilola. Got my chords cut, but I'm singing like it's Sunday. Boys got shut up, and I know this, that one day you'll come stay, so peace. Remember what the nuns say. Love conquers all. I sign off, your loving son, Jay. So again, I think in that one, it was very much a question of trying to keep the energy of the original, but take it in a completely new direction. And I want to finish with again, a slightly longer poem, but I wanted to give you a real contrast, because one of the things I mentioned earlier was I love the full poetic range of Chaucer and the full range of characters and registers, and in the way that he, was sort of reinventing the vernacular and using Englishes, way back in the 14th century. So I want to finish with this tale, which is it's based on the Franklin's Tale, and which is one of my favourite tales. It's there's a lot of infidelity in Chaucer. This one is maybe one of the few ones which has true love in. And but also what I very much wanted to do was to celebrate Chaucer's prosody in his Rime Royale, which was a form that he created for Troilus. It's known as the Troilus stanza. It's a beautiful 7-line stanza with a lovely rhyme scheme, and I wanted to really play around with that. And I wanted to also, I enjoyed playing very much with the magical element, with the sort of magical realism of the piece, which has actually inspired me to go on to write children's books. So this poem is called Maca, which is a Scots word which means both a poet and one who makes things, and it begins with the quote. If you have built castles in the air, your work need not be lost. That is where they should be. Now put the foundations under them. Henry David Thoreau. To Denmark's Freetown Christiania, my mind transports me when it's overcast. When there's a thunderstorm or night draws near, I close my eyes. The heady hit of grass from hash stalls, houses honed from wood and glass. One flaking door, its mirrored hall, the spiral staircase, on that battered sofa, Arul. His purple dreads engrossed in his own story. Arul, who flew too close to gold, dropped out and landed here, the tumble-down 3-story Sesame House, home of the down, the out, who come to learn how to survive without, to make do, make things up, to dare to fabricate a castle out of air, under a master, aka the artist, whose learned thoughts flow deeper than a fjord, and made of Arul's mind a palimpsest, on which he wrote 3 notes that formed a chord, till Arul knew the world within a word, and one long night, through spelling out a spell, cobbled a cabin made of cockle shells with 7 caves, each cave singing the sea, and when the sun came up, his cabin shone. Everyone marvelled at his sorcery. But Freetown states you can't create a home without consent. A clash, and Arul's gone. Squeezed out, forced out, pushed out down Pusher Street. And now here we meet him crossing Princes Street, Edinburgh. Now an actor, single, shaved, who slept on someone's floor 2 years ago till luck ran out. Homeless, then one night caved a home inside the mound, its walls aglow with books, 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 except for one framed photo where you'd expect a mirror. Hogmanay, Deirdre and Angus on their wedding day, his dearest friends. Angus, bleach blonde, well-built. Deirdre, brunette, petite. She made his outfit. Bubble wrap jacket, seersucker kilt, to match her jeans bejewelled with pomegranate seeds, her bubble shoes the perfect fit. Made for each other. Deirdre wears the trousers, Angus the kilt. They're solid, safe as houses, till late Midsummer's Eve. Angus away in England for a month, everyone high on homebrew, except Arul, who today must spell it out, confess to Deirdre why it's agony to look her in the eye, for every time he looks at her, he's cursed. Must say those words 1,000 times rehearsed. I must make love to you. 2 years he's made light of it, nothing of it, forged, invented, a virtue of necessity, betrayed, nothing but love, drunk on itself, unwanted, made a pass. Yet Deirdre's strong, undaunted. I will, she laughs, if for 3 weeks, my Danish bookworm, you can make the castle vanish. Not knowing at that instant Arul texts the artist in his hammock out in Freetown, who knows, this master artist architect, both how to build things up and pull things down, how the right words, verb, adjective and noun, in the right order, uttered in the air, can turn a sandstone castle to thin air. For the small sum of €1,000, which isn't much when love feels more like death. So Arul learns the craft and each day grows as well versed as the witches in Macbeth, predicting destiny with sound and breath. Till August brings the festival, day 1. Edinburgh wakes to find her castle gone. Tourists, their eyes set on wide-angle lens. Actors drop flyers, workers, shoppers dazed. Angus and Deirdre coming back from friends stare at the huge blank empty space, amazed that overnight history's been erased. Throwaway sentence uttered on the solstice, Deirdre chokes, remembering her promise. I gave my word to Arul, she tells Angus, who pales and holds her hand to keep from shaking. The Royal Mile indifferent to their anguish. There's no way out, but take the road not taken. If Arul knows the art of dark unmaking, what more can he unleash, unearth, undo? Make love to him, but let your heart be true. A stone's throw from the castle to the mound, each painful step as heavy as a stone, and each stone building weighted to the ground, each cobbled wind is whispering, run home. A kiss, she takes the final steps alone, her mind reverting to their wedding day, that photograph, but now her lips are grey. Arul, who carved a home inside the mound, is squatting deep inside its entrance. Arul, who sees in Deirdre's bearing how profound true love can be. His monumental oral feat has spelled out love's double-headed arrow. Physical, headstrong, passionately selfish, psychical, heartfelt, passionately selfless. You're both too good for me. Go back to him. Arul is spent, and yet he owes the artist who, hearing of his pupil's altruism, cancelled the debt. Now Arul knows that art is the making of him. Art is his catharsis. Through words, 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 he'll purge the pain, the doubt. The cave erupts and pushes Arul out to reinvent himself again, a maca, to make a poem, hone it room by room, stanza by stanza, form on one blank acre, from bricks and mortar, breath and meter, home. To mount the spiral staircase of his poem, take a battered volume off the shelf, open a random page and read himself. Thank you everybody for listening. I would now like to pass back to Hilary, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you, Patience. And thank you, Marion, for an absolutely enthralling performance and talk. It's absolutely wonderful and very well received by our many listeners at the moment. I have some really quite practical questions. The first of which is Refugee Tales taking place this year? And if so, where? So that's probably for Patience.
Yes, it did. It actually took place the first week of July. So unfortunately, it has happened. But we do. Refugee Tales does sort of happen across the year as well to support the asylum seekers. There are various walks throughout the year in Britain, as I said, in Wales as well. And the model has been taken up in other countries. So sorry, it's happened already, but it will happen again next year in some form, I do hope.
And it was recorded, presumably, this year?
Yes, in fact, yes, there was an excellent recording of the evening event because we weren't allowed to gather. But I believe it's now on YouTube. If you look up Refugee Tales 4, because it's to celebrate also the publication of the 4th collection, you can actually hear 2 of those tales on YouTube. The actual walk wasn't recorded as such, but the tales and the event is excellent and well worth a listen.
Great, thank you. And a similar question really is, with a nice compliment, I'm really enjoying the performance. Are Patience's performance available as talking books? You can get them on my mind's gone completely blank. You can actually buy them. I'll come back to you on that one because it'll just come into my mind when I stop thinking about it. At the moment, I've got Poetry by Heart in my head, and I'm now thinking it's not that one. It's a very famous poetry website, but I can't. Yeah, I've totally forgotten what it is. So I will get back to you on that. I'm really sorry. Thank you. And it's just so interesting to hear the connection which Chaucer had with Latin and the ancient world. And there are 2 questions really which could be slipstreamed. Is there a connection between Ovid and Chaucer regarding iambic pentameter? And who were the intended readers for his poems?
So Chaucer was very heavily influenced by Ovid. You certainly read a lot of Ovid's poetry. I mean, really, you used some of Ovid's metamorphoses in his text, so particularly things such as the Book of the Duchess draws heavily on Ovid, as does the Mansfield Tale, for example. But Ovid is everywhere in his work. I think that he's less influential on him in terms of specific poetic forms. So I think Chaucer is getting his influence in terms of the accentual syllabic line. He's drawing on, so he's reading French syllabic poetry, and then he's reading Italian syllabic poetry, which has stresses in it, unlike the French. And then for English accentual syllabic verse, I think the Italian is really the most influential on his development of the poetic line. But Latin, I mean, Virgil and Ovid are hugely important to Chaucer. And the second part of your question was who was actually reading his verse, is that right? So I think that first of all, it's important for us to think not just about reading, but also about listening. So it actually ties in very nicely with the previous question to patience, which really emphasized that importance of listening to the poetry and not only seeing it on the page, because Chaucer's poetry was itself designed to be heard. So the kinds of people that were hearing or reading Chaucer's verse, they varied quite a lot. I mean, it's important to say that the ordinary and working, farming, ploughing person in England at this time would not be likely to have access to this kind of poetry, but nor is it the people at the very top. So although at one point Chaucer does address the Queen, in general, the people at the top of the court were mainly reading French poetry. When we look at their wills, they're mainly reading French poetry. But we know that people such as chamber knights, so kind of one rung down on the social scale, but still very important, and also merchants, those kinds of people in the city as well as in great households, are reading or hearing his poetry. I think he probably did perform it in somewhere such as the Tabard Inn. You know, he starts the Canterbury Tales in a fictionalized version of this inn, but I think he probably did perform it in those kinds of settings, as well as in more elevated settings. And we have examples of, for instance, a copy of Troilus was used to pay a debt in Chaucer's lifetime to someone who in fact was a scribe who also owned a brothel. So so we know that there was a reasonable range of people who were reading his text, and it was men and women. You know, he was reaching a mixed gender audience.
Mm.
Can I just cut in here and just say it's Poetry Archive. You can find my work on Poetry Archive. You know, quite a lot of the tales recorded some time ago now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And here's a question from Emma to Patience. How did you find translating the ideas of amour courtois played with by Chaucer when you were adapting?
Yeah, courtly love. I mean, I suppose for us it would just seem more romantic love. I suppose you've had an example of that to some degree in the one you just heard in the Macca poem, but also My Knight's Tale was very, I mean, the Knight's Tale is very much the sort of the bastion of courtly love. It was hard, actually. Well, I think in the end I decided to completely subvert that and actually had a relationship going on in somebody's own head. I sort of turned it into a sort of more of a inward looking psychological thing rather than the outward looking, you know, these men kind of die for love and doing all the sort of things for the lady. I totally subverted it. And again, that was one that was quite difficult. It took me quite a long time to get there. I had a whole a version of it which didn't work at all. You know, I was trying to sort of maybe follow it a bit too slavishly. It was the very first one I tried, and I had to sort of go back and think, actually, I need to be able to do something very different with this. Yeah, Jane Draycott, she's done a very amazing version of the medieval dream poem Pearl. She was very helpful at the very beginning of my project. She actually said at times the danger is when you're kind of following in the footsteps of a sort of master poet. You know, the danger is that you just sort of prostrate yourself on the ground, and you should actually think there's different poems you can be. Are you beside him? Are you in front of him? Are you walking in his footsteps? You know, and I suddenly reminded myself there's a lot of room for different positions, for different positionings and different takes on different poems, because when you're doing 24 you have to do that anyway. You have to try different things, and sometimes you make mistakes. So a long answer to a short question, but yes, it's bringing back all the horror I had in the early parts of the project, sort of trying to cope with The Knight's Tale.
Thank you so much. And Margarita asks, what's next for both of you?
Maybe Barry should answer that first.
Sure. So I'm writing a book about the wife of Bath across time. So it's about her as the first kind of relatively ordinary, while also extraordinary, female character in English literature. And the first half of the book is about medieval women and where she comes from, the literary sources, the historical sources, what changes for women after the plague in particular. And then the second half of the book goes right across time, so through 15th century versions of The Wife of Bath, the 16th century where ballads are written and burnt about the Wife of Bath, and it goes right through people like Voltaire up to the present day, up to people such as Patience, and traces different stories about gender right across time, really. Patience.
Yeah, I'm actually writing a series of children's books. I mentioned that the Franklin's Tale, sort of opening a creative door in my head, in that I think I'd shut that door a long time ago, which was the idea of, it was just the supernatural, was the idea of magic or fantasy or something a bit different, rather than gritty urban realism. So I've now written, I've gone into back to sci-fi, which is something I've a few years ago I was very into and watched a lot of films. And so basically I'm writing a series of books called the Leap Cycle series. And I've written the first two. The second one came out very recently, called The Time Thief, and I'm actually working on the third book, which will be called The Circle Breakers, and it'll be out next year. So it'll be the third one of a tetralogy. So the fourth one will come out the following year. So yes, I've actually, and I think Chaucer helped me do that. I think taking on different characters and different registers really gave me the confidence to actually think I might be able to write dialogue. I know I can do character. I now I might think about doing dialogue, and I honestly think I could not have written these novels if I hadn't written Telling Tales.
And Miranda inevitably asks, is Patience going to read these poems live in Canterbury? And I think the answer might be that could have been done before.
Yes, because in 2014, when the book was out, I did a tour started off in Southwark Cathedral and ended up in Canterbury Cathedral precincts, not quite the cathedral, but close. So I have since read some of them in Canterbury as well. And in fact, I posted a slam there, because I very much also, I positioned my Telling Tales as a kind of as a live poetry competition. So I sort of hosted a few events in the past few years in Canterbury, but nothing in the near future coming up. I did actually read one of my Refugee's Tale very recently in Canterbury Cathedral. That's also available online. That was for Refugee Week. There are quite a few of them were recorded, so that's something you can also access, I believe, on YouTube.
Great. Thank you so much. And may I just ask a practical question as the last question? One of our audience has asked, is there a one-volume edition of the tales with the original Middle English and then the appropriate support for the modern reader that you might recommend?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, there's lots of versions. So there's, for instance, there's Jill Mann's Penguin edition of the Canterbury Tales, and there's also David Lawton's recent Norton Canterbury Tales. If you want Chaucer's other poetry as well as the Canterbury Tales, there's the Riverside Chaucer, which I have handily always by my side wherever I am, which has his complete works. But I think that it's most of these versions, they are well glossed and explained. And I think a lot of people do find that when they first start with the Middle English, it seems, a bit unfamiliar and daunting. And then as you go on, you just slip into it and you realize that a lot of words are familiar. It's just the spelling is different, or you kind of get into that zone. And another thing that I often recommend to students is, if they're finding it difficult, read it out loud. Back to that theme that we've been discussing a few times. Read it out loud, hear it. That often makes the language seem more familiar. But there are also, of course, good translations, and I think it's good to access Chaucer in whatever way people are most comfortable.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. This conversation has been absolutely enthralling. Thank you both very much indeed. I'm sure the hundreds who are listening will have enjoyed that greatly. Thank you across the globe for joining us this evening and for listening. Thank you to those who have posed questions. If you would like to enjoy this event again, together with our other events in our Beckett programme, these can be found as recordings on the British Museum Events YouTube channel. Next week, there will be 2 Beckett premieres on YouTube, so they're not related to events. You can only catch them on YouTube as events in their own right. Next week, there will be these 2 premieres on the 29th and 30th of July. These will be Beckett and T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral, and secondly, an exploration of the musical world of Thomas Becket, which is the most gorgeous lecture recital. So I warmly recommend that you join those. But until then, thank you for joining us. And from the British Museum, goodbye.